lovely. Thank you, Hannah. So I think some of the things that I'm going to say actually build on what Laura was talking about, and also might be sort of duplicating what Jean has said a little bit about successful projects. So the reason that Hannah invited me is that I've been working in the heritage sector for about 25 years now and been involved with a lot of different projects. I've sort of had a combined career as a consultant working for a company. I'm now independent, and I've also taught heritage and museum management for nearly 20 years. So I did both of them for a while. I'm on the register of specialist services for the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So I help organisations get funding, but I also assess projects. And that's really why around sustainability, I see a lot of them come in as an expression of interest and then go all the way through to delivery and to legacy. And there are key things that make a project successful and sustainable, and they really go back to the way that it was set up at the beginning, and something that Jean was saying about having professionals involved at the beginning and having those skills is really, really helpful. I work on really tiny projects and also work on huge projects. Probably the largest was Lincoln Castle, which was a £20 million project when you included everything that went around it as part of the regeneration of uphill Lincoln. And that was a massive lottery grant of £12 million. So that's the biggest. But there are the common themes that run throughout all of them. So in terms of a sustainable project, it's really thinking about it beyond a project. I mean, a project by definition has a beginning, middle, and end. That's what, you know, if you even go to the Heritage Fund's guidelines, they tell you to think about. But people often don't think about the afterwards, and they really focus on those just until we get to the end of the lottery grant. And I think that's the key thing. And then that underpins everything. The way, as I say, you set yourself up at the beginning. Are you going to be a CIC, a CIO? You know, who's actually delivering the project, and how does that sit within your organization? So when I'm thinking about long-term sustainability, probably the key one is organizationally. And a lot of organizations really need to go through organizational change to deliver the project, because like Jean, it's a group of committed volunteers that are taking on these massive projects that normally take at least 6 or 7 years, sometimes longer, by the time you've gone through the whole funding process. And it is massive, you know, people dealing with tiny amounts of money and then having huge grants and, you know, multiple consultants involved and really sort of outside their normal comfort zone. So that's really, really huge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Second is around audiences. Who is your market or your audiences, however you want to phrase it, but who's basically going to come and who's going to carry on coming. And of course, a lot of projects that get heritage funding, you're essentially being subsidized like a startup business, but who in the long term is going to keep coming back? And, you know, when the money runs out, are they going to pay for things that you've been giving them free? So that's critical. Obviously, financially, people have a bit of a misconception that when buildings are done up, that the costs are going to go down, but often it's more expensive to run these buildings. People use these buildings more. There's a really good example around a theatre that I worked with, and they had, I think it was an electricity bill of £10,000 or something ridiculous. They had all these lovely gadgets that everybody was playing with, and the bills just went mad from that. So you just have to think about that. And then obviously thinking about the long-term impacts of your project. And something else that's becoming more important is also thinking about your project within what I call the wider ecosystem. How does it fit with everything else that is going on? And how can you tap into that? So we'll talk a little bit more about partnerships. And that is also moving up the agenda a bit in terms of the funders as well. Because you can get very focused on what you're doing, but what is everyone else doing, and understanding that. And finally, and I'll keep coming back to this, is what would success look like? If you look 7 years down the line, what would be success for your project? And I always think, that's quite an important thing to think about. Jean mentioned around vision, that's really important, but how would we describe success? So just digging a little bit deeper is, for me, good governance is at the heart of all these things. And I have put a picture of a church here. This been working on a project which they got funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we're about to finish. And this is really to make themselves more resilient before they even apply for a Heritage Fund grant. And the Heritage Fund were keen to fund this project because they thought it was really interesting that the parish were coming before they even started with a capital project to get themselves into a good position. And it's become really clear through this project, and it is, how does the capital project sit within the wider vision? Because obviously PCCs have a range of things that they do. One of them is looking after the buildings, but also their mission. And how do the two sit next to each other? Because a Heritage Fund won't fund faith, but they will fund buildings if you do heritage engagement activities and if you bring the two together. So I think that's a really good example, is what is your vision? This is what Jean was saying. What is your vision? Keep it clear, be really clear. And that can also be helpful if you think about what are your project aims? I was assessing a project yesterday that is in the middle of the Heritage Fund. They've got all the way, they're giving in 8 weeks, and the project doesn't have any aims. They've got objectives, they know what their outputs are, but there isn't like this vision. They've sort of got a bit lost along the way. It was like, what are you trying to achieve? What will success look like? Just harnessing that back. And how does it fit within the governance structure? So just talking about the church, for example, is the PCCs have a very clear governance structure. They work within the Church of England, for example, how they do things is all written down. And they have committees, for example, but projects often get developed outside that very official structure, whereas a project should be on everybody's agenda, the building agenda, the finance subcommittee, everyone's subcommittee. And I think this is really important because it comes down to, do you have the knowledge, the skills and the networks during the different phases? And again, Jean mentioned that they had an architect, and that's really, really helpful. So on this project, we're looking at how do we have a project steering board, and then how do we have a fundraising committee, a buildings committee, an interpretation, activities and engagement committee, an organizational committee, and how do we have members of the PCC on them? And have we got people within the parish who are engineers, because we're trying to reduce the carbon footprint? Is there anyone who's an architect? We need the treasurer on there, but also very importantly, how do we get young people involved and get them excited about it? So we're thinking about succession planning, because there's a lot of people who feel that they've done their bit. So they're stepping up, but how can we get young people? How can we develop their careers by getting them involved in the project and then pass it on? So that's what's been really useful about having that grant. And that's something that I would really encourage people to do to be sustainable in the long term. They're thinking about, what do we need during the development phase and the fundraising, and then what are we going to need during the delivery phase, and then how do we sustain it in the long term, and how does that fit in with what the parish is trying to do? Who is our community? We're asking all sorts of questions like that, and then thinking about how a professional team might support them, each of those committees. Whereas on lots of projects, they're almost like handed over to a group of consultants. So it's trying to upskill everybody as they go along. And I've put in there not only knowledge and skills that you would normally think about when you do an audit, but also thinking about your networks, because it's important, especially around fundraising. and around community. If you want to be sustainable, then you need to involve as many possible people as you can. And you also need to make sure that you're linked into what everyone else is doing within the community, so that you don't duplicate, and so you can work with each other, because that is just much better. And I do see quite a few projects that are just a really, really committed group of volunteers, but over the long term, it becomes a bit of an issue. So it's because you just don't get those skills passed on. Something else which is good is how diverse is your group. And again, last night, the conversation was, one person who's very insightful was just like, well, what about the young people? We're all sat here and we all look the same. This is their heritage, and how do we pass that on? So we were thinking about age diversity, obviously gender diversity, all sorts of diversity, but I thought that again he was thinking about how can young people calm their skills in social media, for example. We've got a young person helping us with the consultation, so that's something to think about, and helping them build up their CVs as well. And linked to that is around capacity and understanding what it takes to do these projects and how long it's going to take. And that's where the more people you have working together, the better, because it does take a huge amount of work, as those of you who've been involved with projects know. And being very clear about the commitment people are taking on, almost like having role descriptions. What are each of these committees going to do? If you're on the fundraising committee, what is our target? We're talking about 3 years. How much time are we going to need from you? Because then people are more likely to step up. And at this parish, there's an amazing group of people, and nobody's really stepped up because everyone just thinks that they're going to carry on doing it. So sometimes until people step down, people don't step up. So they're going out and they're very clear about, these are the people we need, these are the skills we need you to commit for 3 years on here. The project's probably going to take 7 years. And you also need a leader. Now, this is much easier within a local authority context because you obviously have a project sponsor, but it's also very important for smaller projects and a messaging and making sure that everybody gets the same message out. So governance for me, is at the heart of all of it, and the amount of organizational change that most projects have to go through is huge, and just understanding that and just trying to put those, what I call foundations, at the beginning, I think can make projects much, much more sustainable. And then all the time you're thinking about succession planning. How are you passing on? What happens if somebody moves out of the parish? The second thing I would say, thinking about sustainability, is because of the activities and the actual capital works are really exciting, sometimes people get very focused on those and don't think about the long term. And actually, most funders these days are more outcomes focused. They're thinking about the wider benefits and about the impact. So, in terms of an example, these cushions here are rather lovely. And this is at Southall Minster, which is just outside Newark in Nottinghamshire. And the ladies who repair the cassocks wanted to get involved, and they made these cushions, and they tell the story of the bishops at Southall, and they're lovely. But now the outcome of that project is that people use them to learn about Southall. The guides find them quite useful as well because they can remind themselves. They've got all the dates on the front. But I think that's really, really important, is you've got to think about outcomes, not outputs. And you've got to pitch your project like that. And then you start to think about the longer term. What are we going to achieve overall? Accessibility, inclusion, and diversity are also key for me for sustainability. And that crosses everything. I've mentioned a little bit within the context of the organisation, but it covers your audiences, your staff, if you're lucky to have them, your volunteers and your partners. Because if you want to be sustainable, you've really got to think about broadening your audiences. and thinking about it holistically and involving local communities from the beginning. So, for example, on a project I'm working on at the moment, we've reached out to charities that are working with people who are deaf, hard of hearing and have hearing loss, not only to talk to them about the interpretation and making that accessible, but we're also talking to them about how they can be involved in for example, access guides, so that on the website, some of their clients are actually talking and explaining to other people who are deaf or have hearing loss about how they'll be able to access the museum. We're thinking about how they can be involved as volunteers. We're thinking about how they can be involved as ambassadors. And the deaf community have a really great leisure community. They socialize together because a lot of the deaf people speak British Sign Language, which is a different language. It's not like English. They have different words and phrases. So they go out and socialize together. So they were saying to us is, if you involve us from the very beginning, we'll be ambassadors and everybody will tell everybody about it. But we also need to be involved. We need to be employed. We need to be encouraged to apply for the jobs and think about it in all parts of the project. So that's even been a really good lesson for me around sustainability, because quite often they were saying they're brought in at the very end of the project and people don't always think about them from the very beginning. So we're really excited that they were involved from there. So that's key. And again, involving local communities as ambassadors, but also thinking about, after the project, will they come back? And if they feel that the project belongs to them. So on the same project, we're involving the local brownies that live around there. We're working with Age UK, who want to actually run a dementia cafe within this particular museum because it will have a room. So it's really putting it at the heart. And again, they were saying it's about that sustainability. So my advice would be, is you see lots of projects that come past my desk where there's a massive list of, we're going to engage with all these different people, and I'm like, well, how are you going to sustain that afterwards? And they think that saying they're going to work with, for example, the deaf community, people who are blind and partially sighted, we're going to work with young people, older people, it's a bit of a scattergun because it is just not sustainable. So my mantra is a bit of, let's find out who lives in the community, where there's a demand, see if they want to be involved them from the beginning, and actually focus on certain communities and do deeper, meaningful engagement rather than doing the scattergun. And that's really then thinking about what would be the progression routes for involvement. So for example, involving the brownies in this particular project, we then want them to come to Lambeth Show and put up a little pop-up museum, but we also want them to get involved as volunteers, for example. We want them to bring back their families. You know, there's lots of ways. So we're thinking about how we can go through their life. And, you know, would they consider a career in heritage that they might not have thought about at the beginning? So inclusion and diversity training can be quite useful for this, because I have come across projects in terms of being very inclusive and trying to broaden your audience, is there can be some resistance to this, or maybe people are a bit nervous about it. And I did a session like this quite recently with a group, and it was quite uncomfortable, but it was talking about those groups and, are you in the group or out of the group? And, you know, really got people thinking about who they should talk to, and the fact that even within their church, the younger people said, well, we don't really feel included because we're told, don't worry about it, you're all doing it and we don't need you. And so that was quite interesting. So I think diversity training and building training into your projects can really help with sustainability. Be pragmatic, I've covered that, and also ensure that you have sufficient budget to deliver. So if you decide you are going to work with audiences you haven't worked with before, or people who need communication requirements, you need to put in significant budgets in order to be able to deliver it. because you might, for example, need BSL signers at every meeting that you have with them. So that racks up really quickly. Just one meeting could cost you £1,000 with additional requirements you need to support people. So this is one that Laura might recognise, because this is Lee's Lift in Folkestone, and I've been working with them. We've just put in a round one application, and they actually got one of the viability grants from the Architectural Heritage Fund, which really helped us look at visitor flow and look at what was feasible. But one of the other things on this project, which was really interesting, is we put in a round one a couple of weeks ago, and there's a new question on the lottery form. Why is your organisation best placed to deliver this project? And this was really interesting for us, because of us trying to work with lots of different people within Folkestone. So working with the council, thinking about the library and what they may have, which will help with the interpretation, talking to the museum as a heritage partner, thinking about if we do oral histories, where we might deposit those oral histories, thinking about oral history training, could we work with the museum and share that? Sometimes projects can share volunteers. So there's all sorts of, good examples to think about. Also thinking about partnership working in core audiences. So on this project, we're going to work with Kent Coastal Volunteering, that have done a really interesting project during COVID and produced something called Anthology, which is people's experiences of being isolated during COVID. And they can reach audiences that this is a small group of volunteers on the CIC could never ever reach. But through their befriending, their befrienders, the people that also take people to hospital, they've got 700 people, is working with them. We could just reach a whole new group of people, and then also reach the people that they support. So that is another partnership. So that this is a really good example of a project that is trying to tap into all these different things, and also tap into different arts groups. There's some people doing storytelling, for example, in Folkestone. And those people also have different skills. So they are used to working with people with early onset dementia, for example, which isn't a skill that the CIC have got. And it also shows good value for money, because rather than competing, we're trying to link up and making sure that everybody works together. And after the Heritage Fund money runs out, then there will be sustainability there as well, in terms of support. I mean, there's all sorts of different things, like using the museum's room for school groups, trying to get school groups together, for example, and do joint visits. Just to say, this is another interesting example that it's not open at the moment, but the people are queuing because they're using the lift for as a meanwhile use at the moment, and they're testing out their cafe to see whether or not it's sustainable and will help support the business plan. So that's another interesting aspect of this project. And also have a strong case for support. I think sometimes I feel it's really important project, but you have to remember that it's really, really competitive to get money. And you've got to be really, really clear about what you're delivering, which is around those aims, those benefits, those outcomes, trying to be clear what your project is, that elevator pitch. What are you trying to do, and can you explain it to somebody while you go up in a lift? That is a good test as to whether or not you've got a clear idea. And also thinking about what significance does your site have historically, aesthetically, but also communally, because obviously a lot of grade 2 listed buildings are more limited as to what funding they can get, because they're not grade 2 star or grade 1. But your communal heritage is really important. That's something that the Heritage Fund do fund. So just think about that, and then think about what significance and how would funders see that. So sitting on the other side of the fence, and how it might appear compared to other people. And what are those wider benefits that you're doing? And that is really important if anybody's applying to the National History Heritage Fund this year, because the outcomes, some are more important than others. So how many jobs are you creating? Who are those jobs for? Are they entry-level jobs? We know that young people are really suffering in terms of unemployment, trying to get into the job market. You know, how are you supporting that wider community in terms of recovering from COVID? What are the benefits to older people, for example? Thinking about your community, making it quite personal, and really, as I say, tapping in, looking and thinking about what are the councils doing, and seeing if you can work together. And my other advice would be, think about, when you're putting together your case for support, read the funding guidelines. Really make sure that you have got a strong case for support, but you also need to think about sustainability and legacy. What is going to happen after the money's gone? And when your projects are assessed, particularly through the Heritage Fund, they look at that, you know, and they are used to people saying we're going to continue the job, and people then not continuing jobs, and then as soon as the money runs out, everything stops. So that's really, really important. So Hannah asked me to look a little bit about evaluation and top tips. These are two lovely projects from Southwell at the moment. They're in year 2 of a 3-year activity plan. And despite COVID, they've managed to go out to care homes. The young lady at the top goes to Reach, which is a group that runs for people with learning disabilities. And they were having a talk about the leaves, the famous 13th century carvings, which are in the chapter house there. So I think the key things that I would say is don't rush, sort out your governance, really sort out your budget, and make sure that you've included everything. People are often very quick to go in and not have thought about that, and make sure you have sufficient contingency, because that impacts on your long-term sustainability and what you can do. It's miserable when you do a budget and you don't do enough work on it because you think it's early stages, and then you don't have enough. Really consult with as many people as you can, find out what other people are doing so you don't duplicate, and see if you can actually work together, because that really helps your case. And one of the things, I do evaluations of projects, and one of the things that really came up on Lincoln Castle, and another one, Darlington Theatre, Darlington Hippodrome, is they went on visit as a group to learn lessons and to see what other projects had done. And they found that really, really helpful to talk to people, and talk to people that are further down the line. What are the lessons afterwards? So, you know, people like Jean will tell you now what they should have thought. If they're in the early stages, they don't really know much more than you. It's important to go and talk to people all of the way through. And then often people come back and say, well, we didn't like that when we went to such and such a place. And that sort of shared visiting is really, really helpful. I just can't recommend that enough. It's happened to me on a project, but it's come through on another couple. Be really mindful, if you're a church, that these days churches are in the same group of applications as museums and other heritage sites, and GPAL was a grants for places of worship was a very specific strand of income, and you can't just do your repairs and have a few activities tacked on the end. It needs to be sustainable, and it is complicated, obviously, because of PCC and the faith element, but it is possible to have a really successful project, because I always think churches are about supporting people who are vulnerable. For example, they reach out to the whole community. And so in lots of ways, they're a really good example of a heritage project. But just about putting your projects together and thinking about that sustainability, you've really got to think about that. As I say, read your funders' guidelines multiple times. This is partly frustration from sitting on the other side of the table at the moment with people not doing it. And also, I would say is be reflective about what you do, and learning lessons as you go along.